The wind was howling like a wild animal that night. Jake pulled his jacket tighter as he looked out the window of his small cabin. Snow was falling so hard he could barely see the old pine tree that stood just 20 feet away. He'd been staying at his grandfather's cabin for almost a week now, taking pictures of the winter wildlife for his photography project. Jake loved being alone in the mountains. The city was too noisy, too crowded. Here, he could hear himself think. He could focus on his camera work without anyone bothering him. The cabin was simple but cozy, with a stone fireplace that kept him warm and a kitchen that had everything he needed. But tonight felt different. The storm was getting worse by the hour. He'd never seen snow all this heavy before. The weather report on his old radio had warned about a blizzard. But Jake thought he'd be fine. He had enough food for 2 weeks, and plenty of firewood. What could go wrong? He was making himself some hot coffee when he heard it, a sound that made him freeze. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a tree branch hitting the cabin. It was something else entirely, something that sounded almost like crying, but not quite human. Jake put down his coffee mug and listened carefully. There it was again, a soft whimpering sound coming from outside, near the back of the cabin where he kept his firewood. His heart started beating faster. Could it be a hurt animal? Maybe a deer or elk that got caught in the storm. He grabbed his heavy flashlight and opened the back door. The cold air hit him like a slap in the face. The snow was coming down so hard that his flashlight beam barely cut through it. He stepped outside, his boots crunching in the deep snow. The sound was coming from near the woodshed. Jake moved slowly, his light sweeping back and forth. The wind was so loud he could barely hear anything else. But then he saw something that made him stop breathing. There was a figure in the snow, a person, collapsed near his woodshed, barely moving. But something was wrong, even through the swirling snow. Jake could see that this person looked different, very different. The figure was tall and thin, much thinner than any normal person. And there was something strange about their skin. It seemed to glow faintly, like moonlight on water. Their clothes were torn and looked like they were made of some kind of shiny material he'd never seen before. Jake's mind raced. This couldn't be real. People didn't glow. And what was someone doing out here in the middle of nowhere during a blizzard? The nearest town was 30 miles away, and the road was completely snowed in. But as he stood there, staring in shock, the figure moved slightly. A soft sound escaped from them, like a whisper of pain. Whatever this person was, they were in trouble. They were freezing to death in the storm. Jake's grandfather had always taught him to help others, no matter what. If someone needs help, you help them, the old man used to say. Don't ask questions first. Just help. But this was different. This person didn't look normal. They looked like something out of a science fiction movie. Jake's hands were shaking. And it wasn't just from the cold. He was scared, really scared. The figure moved again, trying to lift their head. That's when Jake saw their eyes. They were large and dark, much larger than human eyes. But there was something in them that Jake recognized: pain, fear, and something else. A kind of intelligence that seemed to reach right into the soul. Those eyes were asking for help, begging for it. Jake made his decision. He couldn't leave anyone out here to freeze. No matter how strange they looked, he put his flashlight in his pocket and carefully approached the figure. As he got closer, he could see that they were shivering violently. Their strange glowing skin was flickering like a candle in the wind. "Hey," Jake said softly, trying to keep his voice calm. "Can you hear me?" The figure turned their head slightly. Their eyes met Jake's, and he felt a jolt of connection. It was like looking into the eyes of a frightened animal. But there was so much more there. This being was intelligent. They understood that Jake was trying to help. Jake knelt down in the snow. The figure was definitely not human, but they were hurt and cold and scared. That was all that mattered right now. "I'm going to help you," Jake said, even though he wasn't sure if they could understand him. "I'm going to get you inside where it's warm." The being was surprisingly light when Jake lifted them. Their body felt different too, almost like they were made of something other than flesh and bone. But they were real, they were alive, and they needed help. Jake carried them through the storm to his cabin. The wind tried to knock him over, and the snow stung his face like tiny needles. But he kept going. Step by step, he made his way to the front door. Once inside, Jake gently laid the figure on his couch near the fireplace. In the warm light of the cabin, he could see them more clearly. They were definitely not human. Their skin had a pearlescent quality, like the inside of a seashell. Their features were delicate, but alien, and their clothes were unlike anything Jake had ever seen. The being was still shivering, their strange skin flickering weakly. Jake knew he had to act fast. He built up the fire until it was blazing hot. He got a bowl of lukewarm water and a cloth to clean the snow from their skin. And then he did something that felt right, even though he couldn't explain why. He went to his bedroom and got his most precious possession. It was a thick, warm blanket that his grandmother had made for him before she died. It was beautiful, with intricate patterns in blues and greens. She'd spent months making it, and it was the last gift she'd ever given him. Jake had never let anyone else use that blanket. It was too special, too important. But looking at this suffering being on his couch, he didn't hesitate. He carefully wrapped the blanket around them, tucking it gently around their shoulders. The moment the blanket touched them, something amazing happened. The being's skin began to glow more steadily. Their shivering slowed down, and those large, dark eyes looked up at Jake with something that could only be described as gratitude. Jake sat back in his chair, his heart still pounding. He had no idea what he'd just done. He had no idea who or what this being was, but he knew one thing for sure. His quiet week in the mountains had just become the most extraordinary experience of his life. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the cabin, warmed by the fire and wrapped in a grandmother's love, two very different beings sat in. The beginning of an understanding that would change everything. Jake couldn't sleep that night. He sat in his old wooden chair, watching the strange being on his couch. The fire crackled softly, casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls every few minutes. He'd get up to add another log or check on his unexpected guest. The being seemed to be resting, but Jake could tell they were still in pain. Their breathing was shallow and quick, not like a human's steady rhythm. Sometimes they would make soft sounds, almost like whispers. Jake wished he could understand what they were trying to say. As the hours passed, Jake started to notice more details about his guest. Their skin wasn't just glowing. It seemed to pulse gently, like a heartbeat made of light. When they moved slightly, tiny sparkles would shimmer across their arms and face. It was beautiful in a way that made Jake's chest feel tight with wonder. The blanket had definitely helped. Jake could see that the being's color was stronger now, more steady. Before, their glow had been flickering like a dying light bulb. Now it was soft and constant, like starlight. Around 3 in the morning, Jake dozed off in his chair. He woke up to find those large dark eyes watching him. The being was awake and alert, though they still looked weak. When they saw Jake looking back, they made a sound that was almost musical. "Hey there," Jake said softly, not wanting to startle them. "How are you feeling?" The being tilted their heads slightly, like they were trying to understand his words. They looked confused but not afraid. That was good. Jake had been worried they might panic when they fully woke up. Jake got up slowly and went to the kitchen. He filled a glass with cool water and brought it back. The being watched every move he made with those incredible eyes. When Jake offered the glass, they stared at it for a long moment. "Water," Jake said, pointing to the glass. "It's safe. It's good for you." The being reached out with one long, delicate finger and touched the glass. Their skin made contact with the water, and Jake watched in amazement as tiny ripples of light spread across the surface. It was like watching liquid starlight. They lifted the glass carefully and took a small sip. Their eyes widened with what looked like surprise, then relief. They drank a little more, and Jake saw some of the tension leave their shoulders. "Good," Jake said, smiling. "That's good." The being looked at Jake's face when he smiled. They seemed fascinated by his expression. Slowly, carefully, they tried to copy it. The result was strange but somehow touching. Their version of a smile was different from a human's, but Jake could feel the warmth behind it. Over the next few hours, Jake tried to make his guests more comfortable. He brought them small pieces of bread, but they could only manage tiny bites. He showed them how to use the bathroom, which seemed to confuse them at first. Everything about human life was clearly foreign to them, but the most amazing thing was how they treated the blanket. They never let go of it, even when Jake helped them sit up to drink water. They kept one hand on the soft fabric. Sometimes Jake would catch them running their fingers over the patterns his grandmother had stitched so carefully. The beings seemed to understand that the blanket was special. They would touch it gently, like they were touching something sacred. A few times, Jake saw them bring a corner of it to their face, as if they were trying to understand it better. On the second morning, Jake woke up to find the being sitting up on the couch, still wrapped in the blanket. They were looking round the cabin with curiosity, studying everything from the stone fireplace to the photographs on Jake's walls. "Good morning," Jake said. The being turned to him and made that musical sound again. It was definitely some kind of greeting. Jake went through his morning routine, making coffee and toast. The being watched everything he did with intense interest. When Jake sat down to eat, they pointed to the food and then to themselves, making a questioning sound. "Are you hungry?" Jake asked. He offered them a small piece of toast. The being took it carefully and examined it closely. They took a tiny bite and chewed thoughtfully. Their face showed that they could eat it, but it wasn't natural for them. Still, they ate the whole piece and made a sound that Jake thought might mean thank you. That afternoon, Jake tried to communicate more with his guest. He pointed to himself and said Jake several times. The beings seemed to understand and pointed to themselves. They made a sound that was like music and wind chimes combined. Jake couldn't repeat it exactly, but he tried his best. The beings seemed pleased with his attempt. They repeated their names slowly, and Jake realized it sounded something like Lyra. He wasn't sure if that was right, but when he said Lyra, the being nodded and made that almost smile again. As the day went on, Jake noticed that Lyra was getting stronger. Their glow was brighter, and they could move around more easily. But they never went anywhere without the blanket. They would stand up and wrap it around themselves like a cloak, or sit with it draped over their shoulders. Jake began to understand that the blanket meant more to Lyra than just warmth. It was the first kindness they had received in what was probably a terrifying situation. They were alone, hurt, and stranded in a world that wasn't their own. And a stranger had given them something precious without asking for anything in return. That evening, as Jake sat by the fire, Lyra did something that made his heart skip. They carefully unwrapped the blanket and held it out to him, making questioning sounds. They wanted to know if he wanted it back. Jake shook his head and gently pushed the blanket back toward them. "It's yours," he said softly. "Keep it." Lyra's eyes seemed to fill with light. They wrapped the blanket around themselves again and made a sound that was thinly happiness. Then they did something Jake would never forget. They reached out and touched his hand. Their skin was warm and tingly, like touching a gentle electric current. For just a moment, Jake felt something incredible. It was like understanding without words, connection without language. He felt Lyra's gratitude flowing into him deeper than any thank you could ever be. In that moment, Jake knew that giving away his grandmother's blanket had been the right thing to do. His grandmother would have approved. She had always said that love was meant to be shared, not kept locked away. As the storm continued to rage outside, Jake and Lyra sat together by the fire, two beings from different worlds connected by a simple act of kindness. The blanket had become more than just fabric and thread. It had become a bridge between their hearts. By the third day, Jake and Lyra had developed their own special way of talking. It wasn't with words, but with gestures, pointing, and sounds that somehow made sense to both of them. Jake would point to something and say its name, and Lyra would repeat it in their musical voice. Sometimes they got it right. Sometimes they both ended up laughing at the strange sounds. Jake discovered that Lyra was incredibly smart. They picked up on things quickly and seemed to understand much more than they could say. When Jake showed them how to work the old radio, Lyra figured out the tuning knob in just a few minutes. They seemed fascinated by the voices coming from the little box, tilting their head and listening intently to every word. The most amazing thing happened on the third morning. Jake was making breakfast when he noticed something strange. The kitchen seemed brighter than usual, even though the sun wasn't shining through the clouds. He looked around, confused, until he saw Lyra sitting at the small table. They were holding their hands about 6 inches apart, and between their palms was a soft ball of light. It wasn't harsh or blinding. It was gentle and warm, like sunlight. Filtering through leaves, Lyra was concentrating hard, and tiny beads of what looked like glowing sweat dotted their forehead. "Ho," Jake breathed, setting down his coffee mug. "That's incredible." Lyra looked up at him and made a sound that seemed almost embarrassed. The light between their hands flickered and went out. They looked down at their hands, then back at Jake, clearly worried about his reaction. No, Jake said quickly, moving closer. "That was amazing. Can you do it again?" Lyra's eyes lit up with relief. They held out their hands again, and slowly, carefully, the light returned. This time they made it bigger, then smaller, then changed its color from white to soft blue to gentle green. It was like watching someone paint with light itself. Jake sat down across from them, completely mesmerized. "Is this how you stayed alive in the cold?" he asked. "You made your own heat?" Lyra seemed to understand. They nodded and pointed outside, where snow was still falling lightly. They made a shivering motion, then created light in their hands again. The message was clear. The light had kept them from freezing to death during those terrible hours in the storm. Over the next few hours, Lyra showed Jake more of what they could do. They could make the light move around the room like a gentle firefly. They could make it bright enough to read by or dim enough to use as a night light. Most amazingly, they could make it warm or cool, depending on what was needed. "You're like a living flashlight," Jake said with wonder. "But so much better." Lyra made their almost smile. At that, they seemed to like making Jake happy with their abilities. That afternoon, Jake decided to show Lyra something special. He brought out his camera and the photos he'd been taking of the winter wildlife. Lyra's reaction was immediate and intense. They stared at the first photograph, a picture of a deer in the snow, with complete fascination. They touched the photo gently, then looked up at Jake with questioning eyes. Jake picked up his camera and showed them how it worked. He took a picture of Lyra sitting at the table, still wrapped in the precious blanket. When he showed them the image on the camera's screen, Lyra made a sound of pure amazement. For the next hour, Lyra looked through every single photo Jake had taken. They studied each one carefully, pointing to different animals and making sounds that Jake thought might be their names. For those creatures, when they came to a photo of a beautiful sunrise over the mountains, Lyra held it for a long time, their eyes soft with something that looked like homesickness. "Do you miss your home?" Jake asked quietly. Lyra looked at him and nodded slowly. They pointed to the photo, then to themselves, then made a gesture toward the sky. Jake understood. Their home was somewhere up there, among the stars. "How did you get here?" Jake asked out. Lyra thought for a moment, then began to draw on a piece of paper. They weren't good at drawing, but Jake could make out what looked like a round shape with other round shapes inside it. They drew lines showing it moving through the sky, then made zigzag marks that might have been lightning or problems. "Your ship crashed?" Jake asked. Lyra nodded sadly. They drew more figures, showing that there had been others with them. They pointed to themselves, then to the other figures, then made a gesture that clearly meant separated. Jake felt a pang of sadness for his new friend. They were alone, just like he often felt alone. But at least Jake could go back to the city whenever he wanted. Lyra was stuck here, far from everything they knew. That evening, something wonderful happened. Jake was sitting by the fire, editing photos on his laptop, when Lyra came over and sat beside him. They were still wrapped in the blanket, but now they let one edge of it drape over Jake's shoulder to dot. It was a simple gesture, but it meant everything. Lyra was sharing the blanket with him. They were including him in the warmth and comfort that his own gift had provided. As they sat together, Lyra began to make soft sounds. It wasn't quite singing, but it was musical and beautiful. Jake realized they were humming, or whatever their version of humming was. The melody was unlike anything he'd ever heard, but it was peaceful and lovely. "That's beautiful," Jake said softly. Lyra paused and looked at him. Then they continued their song, but this time they reached over and touched Jake's hand. Suddenly, Jake could feel the music as well as hear it. It flowed through him like warm honey, filling him with a sense of peace and belonging he'd never experienced before. When the song ended, they sat in comfortable silence. Jake looked at Lyra, and Lyra looked back at him without words. They both understood that something had changed between them. They weren't just strangers helping each other anymore. They were friends. The blanket that had started as a simple act of kindness had become something more. It was a symbol of the connection between them, a bridge that had helped them find each other across the vast differences between their worlds. Outside, the storm had finally stopped. The snow was still falling, but gently now, like a soft whisper. Inside the cabin, warmed by fire and friendship, Jake and Lyra sat together, two souls who had found something precious in the most unexpected place. Jake knew that this experience was changing him. He'd always been a bit of a loner, preferring the quiet of nature to the chaos of human society. But having Lyra here, sharing his space and his life, made him realize how much he'd been missing. Connection, real connection, was worth more than all the solitude in the world. As the night deepened, Jake found himself hoping that somehow this magical time with Lyra would never end. On the sixth morning, Jake woke up to find Lyra standing by the window, looking out at the forest. The snow had stopped completely during the night, and everything outside sparkled like diamonds in the morning sunlight. But there was something different about Lyra. They seemed stronger, more alert. Their glow was brighter than Jake had ever seen it. "Good morning," Jake said, stretching as he got out of his chair. He'd been sleeping in the chair for days now, giving Lyra the comfort of the couch. Lyra turned to him and made their greeting sound, but there was excitement in their voice. They pointed outside and made gestures that Jake had learned meant come and see. They wanted to show him something. Jake felt a mix of curiosity and worry. Lyra had been getting stronger each day, and Jake knew that meant they would probably want to leave soon. The thought made his chest feel heavy. He'd grown so used to having company, to having a friend who saw the world in such a wonderful way. After breakfast, Lyra wrapped a blanket around themselves like a cloak and headed toward the door. Jake grabbed his heavy coat and boots, wondering what his friend wanted to show him. The air outside was crisp and clean, and the snow crunched under their feet as they walked. Lyra led him through the forest, moving with purpose. They seemed to know exactly where they were going. Jake had explored these woods many times, but Lyra was taking him on a path he'd never noticed before. They walked for about 20 minutes, with Lyra occasionally stopping to make sure Jake was keeping up. Then they reached a small clearing that Jake had never seen before. At first, it looked empty except for some oddly shaped lumps in the snow. But as they got closer, Jake realized what he was looking at, and his breath caught in his throat. Half buried in the snow was something that definitely didn't belong in these woods. It was smooth and curved, about the size of a small house. But its shape was unlike anything humans had ever built. The surface seemed to shift colors as Jake looked at it, sometimes silver, sometimes deep blue, sometimes reflecting the sky like a mirror. "Is that?" Jake started to say, but the words died in his throat. He knew what it was. This was Lyra's ship. Lyra nodded and made sounds that Jake understood meant yes and mine. They walked closer to the strange craft, and Jake could see that part of it was damaged. There were cracks in the smooth surface, and some sections looked like they had been torn or melted. Jake walked around the ship in amazement. It was beautiful and terrifying at the same time. The surface felt warm to the touch, even though it had been buried in snow for days. When he put his hand on it, he could feel a faint vibration, like a heartbeat. "It's still alive," Jake whispered. Lyra made an excited sound and nodded. They touched a section of the ship, and suddenly a portion of the surface became transparent. Jake could see inside, and what he saw made his head spin. The interior was filled with soft, glowing surfaces and shapes that seemed to flow like water, but held their form like solid matter. Lyra gestured for Jake to follow them. As they walked around to another section of the ship, here, the damage was more obvious. There was a hole in the side, and Jake could see that some of the internal structures were dark and broken. Through their special way of communicating, Lyra began to explain what had happened. They drew pictures in the snow and made gestures. That painted a clear picture. There had been others with them, friends or family. Jake wasn't sure which. They had been exploring, studying the winter forests and the animals that lived there. But something had gone wrong. The weather had turned bad faster than they expected. Their ship had been damaged, maybe by lightning or the intense cold. During the emergency landing, Lyra had been separated from the others. They had been trying to find each other ever since. "Are your friends okay?" Jake asked, pointing to the figures Lyra had drawn. Lyra made sounds that seemed hopeful but uncertain. They pointed to the sky, then to their ears, making gestures. That Jake thought meant they were trying to listen for signals from the others. For the next hour, Lyra showed Jake how they had been trying to repair the ship. They had been making daily trips to the crash site, using their light abilities to slowly fix the damaged systems. It was delicate work, and they could only do a little at a time without exhausting themselves. Jake watched in fascination as Lyra demonstrated. They placed their hands on a cracked section of the ship and concentrated. Light flowed from their fingers into the crack, and Jake watched as the surface slowly healed itself, becoming smooth and whole again. "That's incredible," Jake breathed. "You're actually fixing it with your hands." Lyra made their almost smile and continued working. But Jake could see that the effort was tiring them. After just a few minutes, they had to stop and rest. "How much more do you need to fix?" Jake asked. Lyra thought for a moment, then held up their hands showing what Jake thought meant 2 or 3. 2 or 3 more days of work, maybe. The reality of the situation hit Jake like a cold wind. In just a few days, Lyra would be able to contact their friends and leave. The magical time they'd shared would be over. Jake would be alone again, back to his quiet life with just his camera and his thoughts. But as they walked back to the cabin, Jake noticed something that made his heart swell with emotion. Lyra was still wearing the blanket, even though they were strong enough now to generate their own warmth. They kept it wrapped around their shoulders, and every few minutes they would touch it gently, like they were checking to make sure it was still there. That evening, they sat by the fire as they had every night, but tonight felt different. There was a sadness in the air, like the feeling you get when summer is ending and you know school is about to start. Lyra seemed to sense Jake's mood. They came over and sat beside him, sharing the blanket as they always did. But this time, they did something new. They took Jake's hand and placed it over their heart, then placed their own hand over Jake's heart. Through their touch, Jake felt something amazing. It was like Lyra was sharing their emotions directly with him. Jake felt gratitude so deep it brought tears to his eyes. He felt affection and friendship stronger than anything he'd ever experienced. And he felt something else too, sadness that their time together was ending. "I'm going to miss you too," Jake said quietly. Lyra made soft sounds that seemed to agree. They sat together in comfortable silence, both knowing that their friendship had changed them in ways they were only beginning to understand. Later that night, as Jake lay in his chair trying to sleep, he thought about the past week, a simple act of kindness. Sharing a blanket with a stranger had led to the most extraordinary friendship of his life. He'd learned that connection could happen between any two beings, no matter how different they seemed, but he'd also learned something else. Sometimes the most precious gifts come into our lives unexpectedly, and sometimes we have to let them go to truly appreciate what they've given us. Tomorrow, Lyra would continue repairing their ship. And soon, very soon, Jake would have to say goodbye to the most remarkable friend he'd ever known. The 8th day dawned clear and bright. Jake woke up to find Lyra already awake, sitting by the window with the blanket wrapped around them. But something was different this morning. There was an energy in the air, a sense that something important was about to happen. "Today?" Jake asked simply. Lyra nodded and made sounds that Jake had learned meant yes and ready. Their ship was finally repaired enough to send the signal to their companions. Today would be the day they would try to contact their friends among the stars. Jake felt his heart sink, but he tried to smile. He'd known this day would come. Lyra belonged with their own kind, in their own world. It wouldn't be fair to want them to stay. They had breakfast together, but neither of them ate much. The cabin felt different, like it was already saying goodbye. Jake packed some food and water for their trip to the ship, and Lyra carefully folded the blanket and carried it with them. The walk to the clearing felt both too long and too short. Jake wanted to stretch out every moment with his friend, but he also wanted to get the hard part over with. When they reached the ship, Jake was amazed to see how much it had changed. The cracks were gone, and the surface gleamed like liquid metal in the morning sun. Lyra approached the ship and touched a section of its surface. A doorway appeared, sliding open silently. Jake had seen this before, but it still took his breath away. The inside of the ship glowed with soft, warm light. Lyra gestured for Jake to come inside with them. Jake hesitated for a moment, then stepped through the doorway. The inside was even more amazing than he'd imagined. The walls seemed to be alive, pulsing gently with patterns of light. There were no sharp corners anywhere. Everything flowed together like the ship had grown rather than been built. Lyra moved to what Jake thought might be a control panel, though it looked nothing like the buttons and switches he was used to. When Lyra placed their hands on the surface, symbols appeared in the air, floating and glowing like tiny stars. Jake watched in fascination as Lyra worked. They moved their hands in complex patterns, and the symbols responded, dancing and rearranging themselves. It was like watching someone conduct an orchestra made of light. Suddenly, the ship hummed to life. Jake felt a vibration through his feet, and the walls began to glow brighter. Lyra made excited sounds and pointed to a section of the wall where new symbols were appearing. "Is that them?" Jake asked. "Your friends?" Lyra nodded enthusiastically. They touched the symbols, and suddenly the cabin was filled with musical sounds that Jake realized was Lyra's language. Other voices were responding, and Jake could hear the joy and relief in those alien tones even though he couldn't understand the words. The conversation went on for several minutes. Jake stood quietly, feeling like he was witnessing something sacred. This was a reunion across the vastness of space. Friends finding each other again after being lost and afraid. Finally, the voices faded, and Lyra turned to Jake with tears of light flowing down their face. Jake had never seen them cry before, but these were clearly tears of happiness. Their friends were safe, and they were coming to get them. But then Lyra did something that surprised Jake. Instead of celebrating, they sat down on the ship's floor and looked sad. They pointed to Jake, then to themselves, then made gestures that clearly meant they didn't want to leave him behind. "It's okay," Jake said, sitting down beside them. "You have to go home. Your friends are waiting for you." Lyra shook their head and made frustrated sounds. They wanted Jake to understand something, but they didn't have the words. Finally, they took Jake's hand and placed it on a glowing section of the wall. Suddenly, Jake's mind was filled with images and feelings that weren't his own. He saw Lyra's world, a beautiful planet with crystal cities and gardens that glow with their own light. He felt Lyra's homesickness, but also their deep affection for him. And he understood something amazing. Lyra's people had been studying Earth, but they had never made contact with humans before. They had been watching from far away, trying to understand what kind of beings lived here. But Lyra's experience with Jake had changed everything. Through the images flowing into his mind, Jake saw what Lyra was trying to tell him. They wanted their people to know about human kindness. They wanted to share the story of how a stranger had saved them and given them something precious without asking for anything in return. When the connection faded, Jake felt dizzy but enlightened. "You want to tell them about us," he said. "About humans?" Lyra nodded eagerly. They pulled the blanket clothes around themselves and made sounds that Jake understood meant it was important, very important. Then Lyra stood up and gestured for Jake to follow them outside. They walked to a different part of the clearing, to a grove of trees that Jake had passed by many times without really noticing. Lyra placed their hands on one of the trees and concentrated. Slowly, the tree began to glow with a soft, beautiful light. Then the light spread to the next tree and the next, until the entire grove was shining like something from a fairy tale. "They're always like this," Lyra said. Or at least that's what Jake thought they meant with their gestures. You just can't see it. Jake stared in wonder. The trees weren't just glowing. They were pulsing with patterns of light, like they were breathing or singing silently. It was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. Lyra touched Jake's eyes gently. With their fingertips, Jake felt a strange tingling sensation, and when he blinked, everything looked different. He could see the light in the trees even when Lyra wasn't touching them. The whole forest was alive with gentle, glowing energy. "This is your gift to me," Jake whispered. Understanding at last, Lyra nodded and made their almost smile. They gestured to Jake's camera, encouraging him to take pictures. Jake spent the next hour photographing the most incredible scenes he'd ever witnessed. The hidden light of the forest was beyond anything he'd ever imagined. As the afternoon wore on, they heard a sound in the sky. Looking up, Jake saw something that made his heart race. A ship, much larger than Lyra's, was descending through the clouds. It moved silently, like a falling star, and landed gently in the clearing. Several beings emerged from the larger ship. They looked similar to Lyra, but wore clothes that shimmered like starlight. When they saw Lyra, they rushed forward with joy and relief. The reunion was beautiful to watch, even though Jake couldn't understand their words. But then something wonderful happened. Lyra brought their friends over to meet Jake through the translation device one of them carried. They were able to speak with him directly. "Lyra has told us of your kindness," the translator said in perfect English. "You saved our friend when they were lost and afraid. You gave them comfort when they had nothing." Jake felt embarrassed by the praise. "I just did what anyone would do," he said. "No," the translator continued, speaking for all of them. "Lyra has shown us that your species possesses something we had not fully understood. True compassion for strangers. This knowledge will change how we approach other worlds." Lyra stepped forward, still clutching the blanket. Through the translator, they spoke directly to Jake. "This blanket represents the first kindness I received on your world." Lyra said, "I will keep it always, and it will remind me that goodness exists everywhere in the universe. But I want to give you something in return." Lyra handed Jake a small device that looked like a crystal but felt warm in his hands. "This will let you speak with me across the stars," Lyra explained, "and the gift I gave your eyes will fade slowly. Over many months, you will have time to capture the hidden beauty of your world before it returns to normal." As the alien ship prepared to leave, Lyra hugged Jake goodbye. It was awkward at first, since neither of their species was used to the other's way of showing affection. But it felt right. "Thank you," Lyra said through the translator, "for the blanket, for the kindness, for showing me that friendship can exist between any two beings who open their hearts." As their ship rose into the sky and disappeared among the stars, Jake stood in the clearing holding the crystal communication device. The trees around him still glowed with hidden light, and his camera was full of the most extraordinary photographs he'd ever taken. He looked down at the device in his hands and smiled. This wasn't goodbye. This was the beginning of a friendship that would span the stars, all because he had given a blanket to a stranger on a cold winter night.